Hi, everyone, and welcome to tonight's presentation. I'm happy to see so many familiar faces and a couple new ones. Tonight, we are joined by Kathy Vasquez. Kathy is the Commercial Food Scraps Recycling Program Manager for Montgomery County. As the program manager, Ms. Vasquez develops and evaluates the county strategies and initiatives to decrease the generation of food waste and increase the recycling of food scraps generated in the commercial sector. Tonight, she will be sharing with us some of her best composting tips and tricks and correcting some of the common misconceptions. Reminder, please remain muted during the presentation. As always, you can send any questions you have in the chat, and there will be an opportunity at the end to unmute for Q&A. If you enjoyed tonight's presentation, make sure to check out our website and join us again next week. Without further ado, Kathy, take it away.
Thank you so much, Dottie, for the introduction. So like she said, we're going to be going over kind of the basics for backyard composting. So please drop any questions that you have in the chat for any of the slides that I show if you need some more clarification. So let's get started. So what is composting, right? Composting is a really simple way to recycle your yard trim and protect the environment. We're really going to be concentrating on composting a specific type of material, which is your yard and garden trimmings, and those include grass, leaves, and garden trimmings. Compost itself is just a really natural process that turns organic material into this really rich, dark, sweet-smelling soil amendment that's great for your plants, and whether they're indoors or outdoors. What are some benefits of composting? So number one, and people love to hear this, is it can definitely save money. If you're composting at home, if you are recycling your yard trim at home in your backyard, you can actually save a lot of money by producing your own compost, because then you don't have to rely on synthetic fertilizers. Additionally, by using compost, you're going to see really great health in all of your lawns and any of your garden plants. Whether you use compost as a top dressing or whether you use compost as a compost tea. Compost is really great at retaining water. So if you add compost into the top couple of layers of your yard or your garden beds, it actually increases the water holding capacity, and anytime there's drought or any fluctuations in temperature, it helps keep the water that the plant has access to kind of stable throughout those seasons. Another great part of compost is that it, because of its water holding capacity, it actually helps when we have large storm events by retaining some of that water, so it doesn't go into any streams or into the Chesapeake water bay. And then the last one is that it's just a really great organic resource, and it helps lead to cleaner soil and cleaner land and air and water. So compost itself is just a simple equation, and there's a couple of different things that you need. There's 4 things. One is brown materials, and we'll go into detail kind of what those brown materials are. The other ones are green materials. Green materials tend to be things that are wet, high in nitrogen, and still have like a greenish color, so they look fresh. You're gonna need air, and you're gonna need water. Once you have a good ratio of all these different things, you're gonna make compost. Depending on how you manage your bin, you can make compost really fast or really slow. It depends on the amount of energy you want to put in and the amount of material that you have on site. I'm a very efficient composter, which means that I'm lazy. I don't like managing my compost bin too much. So normally I usually get compost every 6 to 9 months. But if you are really active in managing your bin, you can get compost probably the quickest between 3 to 6 months. So all of those different ingredients, and the reason why we talk about that equation is we really are trying to get a ecosystem of organisms to survive and thrive in your compost bin. And all of these organisms are what's gonna increase your decomposition of the materials and make compost faster for you. So by feeding them the right browns, feeding them the correct ratio of greens, making sure there's air and water, all of these organisms are going to survive and thrive and going to give you compost faster. So what's going to work best for you? Like I said, there's two different types of composting. There's hot composting and cool composting. Cool composting is what I do because no matter what, compost happens. It happens in nature and it's going to happen in your backyard. Cool composting, like I said earlier, it's slower results, but it's less labor and time involved. So I'm a fan of that. If you want hot composting, which is also very fun to do, to see steam coming out of your compost pile in the middle of winter is kind of a fantastic thing. It also makes compost way faster, but it requires more maintenance. Additionally, you might want to choose whether or not you want a bin. Since you're really only concentrating on garden and yard trims, you can have no bin, you can have a pile. It's easier to maintain, it's easier to turn the materials, and it doesn't require anything to set up. If you do want a bin, the benefits of a bin is that it helps prevent any heat loss, it helps retain moisture, and it helps keep all the materials in one location. So if people ask me if they have a lot of leaves in the fall, it's usually better to start with a bin, so that way your leaves aren't flying around your yard throughout the whole season. If you have mostly like large garden trimmings, large like woody material, you can definitely just have a pile and still make compost with no bin. So what are some acceptable materials for composting? So for our greens, the nitrogen material, those are the things that are going to be fresh. They're going to have high water content. They're going to be fresh plant trimmings, grass, flower, pruning, coffee grounds, fresh hay, and tea bags. In the red here, you'll note that we really discourage people to put food scraps in the bins that the county provides. I'll go back. So if you see in this right hand corner, those compost bins don't have a lid on them and can, if you live in higher density areas of Montgomery County and you're not actively managing your bin, if you put food scraps in it, you can attract some pests like mice or rats. And so we really discourage folks from adding food scraps into these types of bins. For brown materials, browns are your dead, dry, more woody type materials. So those are going to be nutshells and dry leaves and twigs, wood chips, straws, dried leaves, cotton rags, dryer lint, and cooled wood ash. So if you have these materials on site and you're trying to make compost, one of the things that I suggest is keeping the ratio about 2 parts browns and 1 part greens, or 2 parts carbon and 1 part brown. Sorry, 2 parts carbon and 1 part greens. So what that means is that you're going to take 2 parts of the brown material. So if you have 2 buckets of browns and then add 1 bucket of greens, and you're going to mix it up. That'll lead you to getting compost the fastest. So if you keep that ratio, you'll be able to keep enough moisture into your compost bin, you'll be able to keep enough nitrogen and allow enough airflow in your bin so things can break down the fastest. What are some things that you shouldn't put into your compost bin? So dairy products, things like butter, egg yolk, sour cream, yogurt, they do create odor problems. They become anaerobic and they can attract a lot of rodents and pests because they have a high protein content. Anything that may be diseased or insect ridden. If you know that you're always going to have a really hot compost pile, that your compost pile is always going to 140 degrees, you can add your disease plants in there, but it's best to err on the side of caution. A lot of the diseases that are in plants need high temperatures for a long period of time for them to not be viable anymore. You can add those disease plants into your yard trim that gets collected on curbside. Since they do go to a commercial facility, they will, the temperatures will get hot enough to kill those disease plants. Don't add any grease, fats, lard, or oil, because it does create an odor problem and it can attract rodents and flies. Any meat and fish bones and scraps, because it's going to attract rodents and flies. Coal or charcoal ash, like your Kingsford, anything like that, it has accelerant on it, so those things can be harmful for your plants. Pine needles and magnolia leaves, you can add them to your compost pile. It just takes forever for those to break down because they have a really high carbon content. If you want, you can mulch mow those and then add those as mulch on your perennial garden beds. And then the last thing that we want to not put into is your pet waste. So we talked about this a little bit before, but let's get into how to actually compost. So if you pick up one of our bins, or if you're going to start your own pile, what you can do is add some branches to the bottom of the bin, and it's not necessary, but it does help with drainage. You're going to add your brown materials and your green materials, and like I said before, you can do a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 ratio. So it'd be 2 or 3 buckets of browns and 1 bucket of greens. You're going to keep your materials moist, especially leaves. So when we talk about moisture, it's going to be kind of as moist as a wrung out sponge. You don't want your compost pile, if you were to pick it up after you add water, to be dripping wet. You just want enough that all of the materials are nicely coated with water. And what that does is it allows for all of the smaller organisms, like the fungi and the bacteria that do a lot of the compost work, to gain access to those materials to break it down. So once you've done all that, you're going to want to start turning your pile every 1 to 2 weeks, because once you'll notice that the stuff in the middle will break down way faster. And that's because it is not in the sun, it doesn't dry out. It has the ratio is really nice on the inside, but the materials on the outside of the bin will dry out, will turn brown, mostly only browns, and you won't see much greens. So if you turn the materials into the pile, you'll create a better even mixture, and that'll speed up the decomposition. And like I said earlier, compost should be ready 6 to 9 months. If you don't actively maintain it, it usually takes about 3 to 6 months if you're actively maintaining it. Afterwards, after you've done all this and you want to get the good stuff, the black gold, it's going to be on the bottom of your pile. Because of the small particle size, no matter where the compost is created in your pile, whether it's the top of the bin or the middle of the bin, it actually will eventually just fall down to the bottom, and you'll be able to harvest your compost from the bottom. And we always suggest that people let compost cure for just a little while before adding it to your bin. And that'll help with, and curing means that you're just separating it out and putting it to the side for 1 to 2 months. So that way, any weed seeds that are in there will sprout. You know that the material is completely decomposed, and then add that material to your garden beds or your lawn if you're planning on using it there. So another important thing about composting is size matters, right? So like I had said earlier, we are creating an ecosystem in your compost bin. Those organisms that are eating it are really small. So if you have really big materials, it's going to take a very long time for them to decrease and make compost out of those large materials. Decreasing the size of the materials increases the surface area. So all those organisms, whether they are fungi or beneficial bacteria or millipedes or like sow bugs or pill bugs, they will love it more if the materials are smaller. And you're gonna wanna cut everything down to about 6 to 8 inches or the size of your hand. If you cut the material down smaller, what will happen is you'll cause some airflow issues in your compost pile. So 6 to 8 inches tends to be kind of a good rule of thumb when cutting your material I had said this earlier, but so when talking about water, you're going to keep things around 50 to 60%. 50 to 60% is that moisture of or wrung out sponge, so it's going to be wet but not dripping. If you have too much moisture, you're going to slow down decomposition, and you can cause the compost pile to become anaerobic or low in oxygen. And you'll know this right away. Like, you'll go into your pile and it'll smell either like a wetland, or it'll smell kind of sweet. And if it smells sweet, it just means that it went anaerobic. And then you're going to want to add more brown material into there to kind of help with the added moisture. If it's too dry, it can slow down the bacterial growth or any of the movement of any of those organisms. So if you don't mind that, it just means that it's going to take a longer time for your compost pile to turn into compost. Materials contain extra moisture. So if you don't want to add water to your pile, if you don't want to spray anything on it, you can add moisture by adding things that are green materials or nitrogen-rich materials, because that will add moisture into your pile. That's my preferred method of adding moisture into the pile, because I can kind of control the moisture a little bit more instead of spraying a pile with a hose. The other important part is you want to make sure that your compost pile actually has a lot of oxygen and airflow, because since we're trying to create an ecosystem in there, the oxygen is going to help keep those organisms inside your bin so that they can do the work for you. Compost piles usually have about 15 to 20% oxygen. And during active composting, which means when the temperature goes up, the oxygen can go down. So we want to make sure that there is enough airflow. One of the ways that you can add air to your compost pile is by mixing it. You can poke it with a bunch of different types of tools. There's a thing called a wing dinger that will make aeration holes in your compost pile. You can mix it with a pitchfork or a shovel, and all those things will add air into your pile. If you notice that you're still not getting enough air, even though you're mixing it, you're turning it, you're pulling the whole compost pile out and then mixing it and putting it back in, it may mean that you need more brown materials that are woody. So things that are branches or things that are twigs to add that airspace in your pile. And this is a really great image of just, one of our volunteers who the tool he has in his hand is called a wing dinger, and it's actually making holes in the pile to provide a little bit of air to all this compacted leaves that he has. And then if you really get interested in composting and you want to have it hot, you can always check the temperature. So the ideal temperature for hot composting is between 104 and 122. Depending how you're managing your bin, that temperature can last up to 5 days. If you're constantly adding green material into your bin to keep that ratio the same, you can maintain that temperature forever. I used to compost food scraps in New York City in the middle of winter, and we used to be able to keep the temperature between 120 and 130 for the whole winter, because we were constantly adding material into our compost pile. Temperature is affected by the same things the organisms are affected by. The temperature is actually coming from the organisms decomposing the material. So because there's so many organisms in your pile, and because they're so happy, they're throwing a little party and their bodies are warming up and they're creating those spikes in temperature. So if they're happy with the moisture content, which is going to be between 50 and 60%, with the airflow that you're trying to keep relatively high so that they can have enough air in there, and then the carbon and nitrogen ratio, you're going to be able to keep and maintain that temperature. If you notice that your temperature goes down, it's going to be affected by one of those three things. And then for the hot composting or the active composting, the other big thing that's important is the size of your pile. So normally we suggest that people do 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, which is kind of like a cubic yard. And that amount of material, if you're actively managing it, will eventually heat up. If you go smaller, it's going to be harder for that material to be hot because it doesn't have enough insulation in the pile. So these are just some examples of different types of compost bins that are out there. And each of these can be managed differently depending on kind of the materials that you put in and because of the type of actual bin they are. Tumblers are way different than, those are the ones that are on the bottom, are way different than the static compost piles or stationary compost bins that are on top. Tumblers actually work really well if you do a batch method of composting, which means that you kind of hold back your materials in a separate location. And then once you have enough materials to fill your compost tumbler, you put everything in there at once, and then you set it and forget it. And you come back every maybe 1 to 2 weeks and check it to make sure the moisture content is well. You don't add any more materials in it. And then at the end of 3 to 6 months, you can pull out the finished compost. So this is just a list of some common issues that people have when composting for the first time. So if your compost pile is too dry, you're going to have not enough macro or microorganisms, and those are the ones who are primarily doing the decomposition in your pile. You can add water, or you can add green materials such as glass clippings, and that'll increase the amount of macro or microorganisms in there because they'll be happy. If your pile is too wet, this will slow down your decomposition. The best way to deal with a wet pile is to add more brown materials and bulking agents such as twigs and dry straw, and that'll help absorb the moisture and also add airflow. If you find that nothing is happening, it might be that you put way too many browns or way too many much carbon in there. So you're going to want to add more green materials into the pile. So greens would just be fresh leaves, fresh garden trimmings, fresh grass, and then mix everything up to make sure the greens are touching all of the brown material. If the compost pile is emitting an odor, it means, and it smells bad. So like I said, sometimes it can smell sweet and it's not a problem, or it can smell like sulfur, or it can smell like a wetland. Then you're gonna wanna add some brown materials to help with the bulking of the pile to get airspace into your pile. So the whole reason why you're doing that is because you want compost in your garden so everything can be amazing and healthy. If you look on the right, there's a great image of a study that happened out in Woods and Research Laboratory. So on the left is plant roots with no compost, and then on the right is plant roots with compost. And as you can tell, the with compost is substantially better. You're going to have a lot more root growth. You're going to also have good bacteria that's in the soil, so that can lead to healthier plants as well. Because your plants are healthy, it's going to suppress a lot of the diseases it may potentially get. And then with compost, the biggest reason most people do it, you get a slow release of nutrients. So over time, the plants are not just getting a boost in the beginning of the year, they're getting consistent nutrients throughout the whole summer and the growing season. And then how to use your compost. So hopefully at the end of 3 to 6 months, or if you're like me, 6 to 9 months, you'll get some finished compost. So there's a couple of different ways that you can use it in your backyard. One is you can just spread a layer of 3 inches of compost on your garden bed and then mix it into the top 6 inches of your soil. You could make potting mix. So if you want to use your compost indoors, you can mix equal parts of compost, sand, and clean potting soil and use that as a potting mix for indoor plants, or you can use it as a mix for after your seeds have started and are going into the next phase. And then you can just use it as a fertilizer across your lawn. So you can just spread a 1/4 inch of fertilizer or compost on your lawn in the fall, and that'll help in the spring make sure that your grass is well fed for the growing season. This is a bunch of resources that we have out there that you can find more information on composting. And this is my contact information. So if at any point in time you have more questions about composting, please let me know. I love talking about compost. I could talk about compost forever. So what I'll do right now is I will stop sharing my screen, and then we can answer any questions that anyone has.
Feel free to either put them in the chat or unmute and ask them yourself this time. I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about how the tumbling type compost bins work.
Yeah, so a lot of people like the tumblers because they tend to be smaller than the static or the stationary compost piles, and they sometimes are elevated as well, so it's easier to manage if you have like back problems or accessibility issues. They, like I said earlier, they work as best as a batch system because they have a small volume on the inside. So if you pull all the materials, if you gather all your materials like in a separate area, and then once you have enough browns and greens, and then put everything into the bin at the same time, you'll have better luck with a tumbler. What the most common complaint that I have from people about tumblers is that they get too heavy because people keep on shoving stuff in there, and then they're not able to turn it. So by doing a batch system where you kind of hold everything and then put everything in once, it allows you to not overstuff the bin, and then also allows you to pull the compost out so that way you can kind of reset it and then put some more stuff in.
Another question I see in the chat is, can you go over again how to tell if your compost is ready to use?
Yeah, definitely. So if your compost is ready to use, it's going to look dark and crumbly. It's going to be sweet smelling, and it's going to be on the bottom of your bin. If you pull it out and you're like, oh, I don't know if it's ready yet, one of the things that you can do, it's called a bag test. So you can take a scoop of your finished compost, you can put it into a Ziploc bag and seal it closed, and then come back to it in about 2 to 3 days. If you open it and it has no odor, it means your compost is completely finished. And the reason that it doesn't have any odor is because all of the organisms, all the material is completely decomposed. So there's nothing in there to break down. So the organisms are essentially not living in there anymore to do the work of breaking stuff down. So that's a quick way to tell.
The next question I see in the chat says, sorry if you already covered this, do you have to add organisms? If so, which ones and where should we get them?
No, you don't have to add organisms. There's some people who swear by adding a scoop of finished compost from their previous pile into their new pile because it'll have some of the organisms. But the organisms are currently living in your backyard. They're on the material that you're putting into your compost bins. And like the Field of Dreams says, if you build it, they will come, right? So if you put the materials in there, if they're the right moisture, if it's the right ratio, they will survive and thrive in your bin. Like I said earlier, I'm come from New York City, right? You think there's no organisms over there. We've built compost piles and bins literally on concrete, and you've had organisms come because they're on the materials that you put
in. The next question I see says, is there any reason that worms were not mentioned?
Oh no, worms are going to be there too. So if you're doing cold composting, worms are going to be worms, and like pill bugs and millipedes are going to be the primary organisms that are doing the cold composting work. If you are gearing towards hot composting, it's really going to be the macro and microorganisms that are doing the work. And then the microorganisms that are doing my work. And then the worms will actually be on the outside of the bin because they want to be warm, but they don't want to be 120 degrees warm. So they'll actually do all the work on the outside of the bin. And then when you turn it, they'll move back to the outside of the bin. So they'll be there, but they're not as active in a hot composting system.
Tookie commented, I know our library generally distributes bins, but they're closed for 6 months in Poolsville. So where are some other free resources?
Yeah, so what I can do is I can link to the PDF of all the different locations. I can drop it into the chat. So that PDF will have all of the locations in Montgomery County where you can pick up a bin. We currently have 20 locations that are in operation where you can pick up a bin.
Do we have any more questions? I'm curious what you personally use for composting day to day. Like, what's your composting practice? Like, how do you incorporate it?
Yeah, so I use an earth machine, which is the one that looks like a little Darth Vader helmet that I showed you in the types of compost bins. I like that one because it's relatively cheap it was the cheapest one, which is nice. It also has a lid, so it just is even though in Montgomery County, you don't we are promoting folks just to use garden trimmings. I like it. The lid also helps with maintaining the moisture. So the way that I use my bin is I use it anytime I'm doing any garden work. So if I'm going out there, I'll make sure that I have clippers and drag my husband out, and then we will try to clip everything at the same time and put it into the bin. And then I kind of set it and forget it. I won't come back and look at it until I'm out there again, or I need compost, and I'm like, oh, let me just check to see if anything is at the bottom. The earth machine's nice because it does have that little door on the bottom, so you don't have to lift the whole bin to get the compost out.
When you're actually applying your compost to your garden, would you do it any differently than when you're gardening with regular soil, or is it pretty much the same process?
Yeah, so with compost, it really depends on how much you have. So if you've created a ton of compost, you can add quite a bit to your garden soil every year. You can add it for every time you're planting materials. So if you have a ton of compost that you've created in your backyard, as we're going into fall, you can put some in the completely over everything in the fall as you're laying your garden bed to rest. If you want, you can in the spring when you're planting the materials, you can side dress all of your plants, so that way you don't have to use all of the compost at once. Or if you've created a very small amount of compost, one of the ways that you can add compost into your garden beds is by making a really simple compost tea. There are really great YouTube videos, and I can send them to you later, where you just add a bubbler with your small amount of compost into a 5-gallon bucket and let it sit for 24 hours, and then use that to fertilize your plants. And so there are different methods. It just depends on how much you actually have.
Tonight you talked a lot about like lawn focused composting. I would be curious to hear a little bit more about your work for Montgomery County when it comes to commercial food waste.
Oh yeah, so actually I can even talk about residential food waste first before we talked about commercial food waste. So on the resident side, one of the things that we are testing out right now, and we're going to be rolling it out in the next couple of months, is we got a group of about 450 Montgomery County resident volunteers who are going to be testing out 2 types of compost bins for specifically food scraps. So we're trying to figure out which of these bins could be rodent proof, because in our Chapter 48 legislation, in order for us to recycle or compost food scraps in your backyard, the bins need to be rodent proof. So we're doing this project to see which one is rodent proof, so that way we can potentially offer it to Montgomery County residents in the future as an option if they want to start doing their food scraps. The other thing, so on the commercial side, what I do is I work with businesses that have never had any sort of compost or food scrap recycling before. And we know within the department that food scraps are kind of the next step. In commercial businesses, they produce about 68,000 tons of food scraps every year. So it's a big portion of our waste stream, and we know that that has to come out so that way we can effectively use our resources well within the county. So one of the things that I do is I coach these businesses and organizations that produce a lot of food waste. We train them, we provide them with resources, we give them a whole year of collection service. And then at the end of the year, they transition over to a private waste hauler because they got everything down packed. So they know how to put the materials in, they know which materials to put in. They have trained all their staff. So the transition from them being with us for a year into going to one of the private haulers that offer the service is way easier for them. So we're just kind of like the training wheels to get them started. That way they feel confident to move to a private waste hauler.
Yeah, that's really cool. Do you know how much commercial or residential food waste that Montgomery County produces?
Yeah, I know. So in total, I may have to do some quick math. So in total, the county itself, and this includes multifamily, residential, and commercial, produces 128,000 tons of food scraps a year annually. For residential and multifamily, that is 60,000, and I believe I don't know I don't know which percentage of that 60,000 tons is resident and multifamily. So any of the residentials is going to be about 50,000 tons a year. And one of the other things that the county itself, or our department is doing as well is we hopefully in the spring or this September, we'll be rolling out a single family food scrap pilot where folks would be able to, in specific areas of the county, will be able to get collection service for a year as a pilot to see if this is something that can be rolled out countywide. So this hopefully will be a 2-year pilot project where we can onboard each 1,700 residents to see if they would be interested in it possibly being rolled out everywhere, which is great.
That's really cool. What would that program look like, getting the scraps picked up?
So right now, what it looks like is everybody will get a countertop container, and then they will also get a 35-gallon cart that would be outside, and then they would get pickup. I don't know the details yet. I think it's once a week that we get pickup. Similar to recycling, they would get the pickup once a week, and they would get compostable bags and liners for the inside of the carts. So we just help with maintaining the cleanliness of the carts and keeping odors down.
Do you have any more questions? Feel free to either unmute or send them in the chat.
And then the other thing that I want to ask you folks is, I kind of talk about the backyard food scraps composting. If anybody's interested, we do have some additional spaces available. So if you want to join the resident volunteers who are testing out some compost bins, you can email me. I can drop my email in the chat, and then we can see if we can add you to the list. So that way you can test out some of our compost bins. So the way that the project is working is you would get probably the earth machine, because that's the one that we have additional spaces for. And then you would also get access to additional materials, educational materials, specifically talking about food scrap composting. And then you would just have to fill out a data sheet for us. So it would be like how much food waste you're adding to the bins, how many times you're managing the materials, is your temperature going up, are you experiencing any issues with the bin? And then you'll provide us with that information so we can figure out what the next steps are for backyard food scrap composting. And let me just write my email address in here.
So this might sound like a silly question, but how would you monitor the temperature of your pile? Would you use a thermometer?
Yeah, we are. So if you're part of this project, we are giving you a compost thermometer. Also, we're giving you a luggage scale so you can weigh your food scraps as you're putting it into the bin.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, if we have no further questions, as a reminder, you can always email Kathy if you'd like to try and join this program. You can email us if you have any later questions. I'd just like to thank everyone so much for joining us tonight. You can email us any questions you have later at info@poolsvilleseniors.org. If you'd like to unmute or turn on your camera to say goodbye, now's the time. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, please leave a like and a comment. I'd like to thank Kathy for this presentation, as well as our ongoing sponsors and private contributors that help us keep our programs going, because we love putting them on for you. If you enjoyed tonight's program, please consider joining us for more upcoming events. This time next week, we'll be back with Kenny Scholes and his historic property lecture for September. You can check out our website, poolsvilleseniors.org, for more info and registration. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank Kathy for all of these wonderful handouts we're going to have at our booth on Poolsville Day. So be sure to stop by. And Kathy thinks that they'll have a booth also with handouts. So you check out both booths.
Yeah, thanks for the reminder, Tookie. If you missed it at the beginning, make sure to stop by our booth and Kathy's booth. We'll have all kinds of resources, and Poolsville Seniors is also going to be doing a drawing and have a fun quiz game and all kinds of things going on. So make sure to stop by if you're at Poolsville Day and check us out and say hello.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thanks
you,
so much, Kathy.
Have a nice night.
Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Good night, everyone.